to what I find a very interesting thesis that democracy in and of itself is flawed because it makes assumptions that are not valid. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Sure. So the ultimate decision making in democracy, at least in principle, is by the voters. The voters decide, who will be elected to various positions, and at least in theory, they're supposed to do that based on evaluating the issues, the candidates, their proposed policies, and so on. The problem is that doing that requires voters to be at least somewhat well informed. And most of the time, they just aren't. And that's not necessarily because the voters are stupid or because the information isn't available. There's plenty of information available. Most voters probably aren't stupid. Some are, but most probably are not. It's rather because of rational behavior in response to incentives. Imagine that your only reason to become informed about politics is that you want to be a better voter. You want to vote for, quote unquote, the right person in the next presidential election or in other elections for Congress, for state government, and so on. That turns out not to be much of an incentive at all, because the chance that your vote, no matter how well informed, will make a difference to the outcome of an election is infinitesimally small. In the
Mm,
US presidential election, it's about 1 in 60 million, though it varies somewhat by state. If you live in a relative swing state, it's a little bit higher. If you live in a extreme blue state or red state, it's even lower, and so on. And so that creates almost no incentive to actually be well informed if your only reason for doing so is to be a better voter. And for that reason, most voters are what economists call rationally ignorant. It's rational for them to spend little or no time seeking out information about government and public policy. And lots of survey data, some of it compiled in my book, Democracy and Political Ignorance, shows this. Now, there is a minority of voters who do pay attention for other reasons. I analogize them to some extent to sports fans. I'm a sports fan.
mm,
When I pay attention to my favorite NBA team or NFL team and so on, it's not because I think I can influence the outcome of games, though I wish I could. It's because
mm.
it's fun to be a fan. It's fun to root for my favorite team. And sometimes, it's fun to hate the opposing team. I'm a big Boston Red Sox fan, so I hate the New York Yankees, for
Of
example.
course.
Duke fans hate North Carolina and vice versa, and
Right.
so on. And so there are people who in my work I call political fans, those who follow politics not because, or at least not primarily because they want to be a better voter, but just because they find it interesting and they want to cheer on their favorite political team. But when you seek out information for the purpose of being a fan and enhancing your fan experience rather than seeking the truth, you tend to be highly biased in your evaluation of that information. And that's exactly how political fans behave. They overvalue anything that supports their pre existing views while undervaluing or ignoring anything that cuts against them. They're prone to conspiracy theories that support their positions, even like those Trump spun about the 2020 election and other issues. And there are other examples like this. So, in sum, we have a two-level problem.
Mm,
Most voters are just rationally ignorant. They know very little about politics and government. They don't follow it much. There's a minority whom I call the political fans. They know much more, but they're extremely biased and they do a very poor job of evaluating the information they get because truth seeking is not really their primary goal in seeking out that knowledge. And the combined effect of the rationally ignorant majority and the political fan minority is often very poor quality decision making by voters.
right. So it's interesting because that was a great answer, and I appreciate it. Thank you. But okay, I'm a big sports fan too, former sports writer, so I get your analogy. But let me just throw back a couple of questions at you. So, for example, if I'm a Giants fan in the NFL, I can't affect their play calling on the field as a fan. I can't get in the coach's ear as a fan typically. But if enough fans, for example, say we want a new quarterback or we want a new wide receiver, they stop showing up to the games. The ratings on TV go down. Those are ancillary effects that could influence the Giants, say, draft pick coming up in April. Do you see politics working that way, or is it a wasted effort to try to have this ancillary influence, especially in non-swing states?
To some extent, obviously, yes, if enough people get mad at the existing government, it either will be thrown out of office or will have to change its ways or whatnot. The problem is this, that, well, if enough political fans or voters, you want to call them, decide that it will have that effect, the incentive of individual voters is still some combination of either being ignorant if they're just not interested in politics for its own sake, or to be fans because there's a big difference between what might be good for the group as an aggregate and the incentives of individuals. This comes up in other situations in life as well, where individual incentives lead to behavior which is harmful for the group as a whole. The tragedy of the commons is an example of that. And this is the same sort of a thing. So the bottom line is that, yes, if enough if a large enough number of voters were to become well informed and act on that, then things might improve. But they don't have much incentive to do that, especially given the enormous size and complexity of modern government, where it's not just a matter of you have to learn just a few things to make good decisions. You likely have to learn quite a lot. At least you're going to keep track of the full range of issues that modern government deals with. They spend over a third of GDP is government spending. They regulate almost every aspect of our lives and so on. So it's not a trivial knowledge burden that would have to be overcome. Now, it is true, as per your analogy with sports fans, that some people can influence things in ways other than voting, but still only a small minority of voters actually have the ability to do that. Only a small number of them can do things like have a big influence through, say, campaign contributions
Right.
or by lobbying or whatnot. And so for most voters, this incentive structure still holds true.
Right, right. So it sounds to me that if I weren't aware of your libertarian predilection, that in some ways you're telling me democracy is almost useless. It's just right now it's illusory, right? Because we think we might have some effect. But again, in very rare circumstances, maybe in the swing state or something to that effect, um, it sounds like, especially on the federal level, we have very little outcome as individual voters. That it's uh, that. So if democracy doesn't work due to this unintended or intended ignorance of the voter, what solutions do you have? Now, as a libertarian, we would say perhaps take power, decentralize power, right? Because if any one federal officer or one federal office or whatever, it doesn't have enough power to influence your life, then it's not an issue, as much of an issue, correct?
So I would say a couple things. One is I would not say democracy totally doesn't work, because
Okay.
democracy does still have this one important advantage over non-democratic systems, which is that if the government in power is doing something wrong in a way that's extremely obvious, even to very ignorant voters, then the voters will punish them at the polls, and that will have an effect. Does the great economist A.K. Sen showed that famines almost never happen in democracies, whereas in dictatorships they're common, and some dictatorships even deliberately organize famines. The
Right.
reason for that is even voters who are extremely ignorant know very little. If there's a famine going on, they will notice it. They will tend to blame the incumbent government and it will be voted out. So democracy does have that significant value. But for a high percentage of decisions the government makes, the voters have little understanding of what is going on. They do a poor job of evaluating the evidence and so on. And so while democracy is less bad than dictatorship or oligarchy, it still has very serious flaws. Now, what is it that we can do about them? There's a number of different solutions that various thinkers have proposed. To me, the most promising of them, though there are others that might have some value, the most promising is to empower people to make more of their decisions by voting with their feet, which is what I advocate in my book, Free to Move, and to some extent in my earlier book, Democracy and Political Ignorance, which I mentioned. What is voting with your feet? There are three ways we can vote with our feet. One is we can decide which jurisdiction we want to live in a federal system, like which state or local government, and make that decision in part based on the government policies that exist there with taxes,
Right.
education, law enforcement, and so on. Another way is through international migration. America was peopled primarily by immigrants who voted with their feet for the US against other countries. And then a third way is in the private sector.
Mm.
When we make decisions in the private sector, in some cases, they can provide some of the same kinds of services as are usually associated with state or local governments, like education. Private planned communities are an example of this, and so on. What is the difference between voting with your feet and voting at the ballot box, and why is one better for an informational point of view than the other? It's because when you vote with your feet, the chance that your decision will make a difference is very high. In many cases, it's 100%. And for that reason, you have incentives to seek out information and also to do a good job of evaluating it. If you're like most people, you probably spent more time seeking out information the last time you decided what television set to buy or what smartphone to get than the last time you decided who to vote for president or for any other office. That's not because your TV is more complicated than the issues the president decides, or that the TV is more important. It's that that the TV you choose will very likely be the one that actually ends up in your living room. Whereas if you get the TV and you turn it on and you have the misfortune to see the president or some other politician, the chance that you can affect who that is or what policies they adopt is infinitesimally small. And so you rationally spend less time on that decision than on the other one. And similarly, there's better incentives to evaluate the information that you do learn objectively. And most people are, in fact, more objective and unbiased about foot voting decisions than about ballot box voting decisions. There's a lot of data
Right.
to show that, some of which I go over in my two books.
Right. And certainly we've seen concrete examples of this the last couple of years. The mass migration, say, from California to Texas due to their policies, from New York to Florida, both those big blue, very liberal states, high tax rates, they've seen the migration of their tax bases leave. And it'll be interesting to see if they somehow adjust their policies